There are few figures in history as disturbing as Charles Manson, a failed musician turned cult leader who believed songs held hidden messages and convinced his followers to kill in the name of an apocalyptic prophecy. What drove him to these crimes? What are the conspiracy theories? And how much did rock music play a role? All of this discussed next with author Nicholas Tochka.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. My guest is Nicholas Tochka, author of The Musical Lives of Charles Manson, The Beatles, The Beach Boys, and the Invention of the 60s, or No Sense Makes Sense. Welcome to the podcast, Nicholas.
Thanks very much, Eric.
The book provides an absolutely fascinating analysis of Charles Manson, his music. It explores his role as a failed singer-songwriter and how his musical aspirations influenced the family and the 1969 Tate LaBianca murders on August 9th and 10th, 1969. I'm sure everybody knows about it, but it's a series of brutal killings that were committed by members of the Manson family cult in Los Angeles. Manson's followers murdered actress Sharon Tate and four others on August 9th, followed by Lino and Rosemary LaBianca on August 10th. It shocked the nation. You make it clear up front that this book is not objective. So talk about how you approach this book and Charles Manson.
Yeah, so you've given us a really good synopsis of what the quote-unquote Manson murders look like. And that story that the failed singer-songwriter, this devious mastermind who was a cult leader, who brainwashed his followers, who was instructed with secret messages found in Beatles songs that led them to kill. This is the story that's found in Vincent Bugliosi's, really the first major mass market success true crime story, Helter Skelter. And I begin by saying that this book isn't objective because what I want to do in this book is look at that narrative and then look at all of the other narratives, all of the other stories that people have used to tell the story of the Manson family, Charles Manson and his followers, and the Tate LaBianca killings, in order to understand something about how we narrate history and the ways in which different kinds of genres, from rock criticism to true crime to gonzo journalism to conspiracy theorizing, have kind of given rise to the world that we live in today, a world of disinformation, a post-truth world, a world in which we have come to understand reality as itself being produced or constructed as kind of subject to debate.
Yeah, we know that the story of Manson has been well documented in books, as you say, in documentaries and film. The moment we focus most on is when he gets out of prison. It was 7 years. He was at Terminal Island, right, in San Pedro, California.
That's right.
And he was released March 21st of 1967. And that really is where many of these stories start. Of course, his childhood has also been investigated and looked into to try to explain these things. But I've heard many things about that period, though, while he was in prison that affected Manson. The Beatles coming along, he studied Scientology, he became really serious about music. How did those years while in prison influence what he would do when he got out, in your opinion, and from what you learned doing research for the book?
Yeah, that's right. So there are kind of two clusters of stories that people have told about Manson's time in prison. One, of course, has to do with music making. He learned to play guitar by a kind of notable 1930s, 1940s gangster named Creepy Karpis. He also played drum set. It seemed as if the prison had a couple of musical instruments for musicians to perform together. Toward the end of his time in prison, we have from psychological reports and parole reports getting ready for his release, this idea that he had become obsessed with the Beatles and that he was writing songs, and that when his release from prison, he would try to make it as a songwriter. These have been recounted in all of the books that have been written about Manson from the 70s onward. And they kind of suggest this story of someone who had been sort of captured by the sound of the Beatles and captured by this kind of youth movement. So that's one set of stories about what he learned in prison in terms of thinking about becoming a musician. And then, of course, there are all these debates about, was this legitimate? Was this perhaps a way that Manson was going to try to deke out his parole officer and have the ability to move around because he needed to go get gigs and so on. Of course, the second set of things that he learned in prison had to do with all of, being incarcerated with people who were pimps, people who were bank robbers, people who were hardened criminals. Also seems that at this time there were a lot of different kinds of philosophical systems that were floating around. You mentioned Scientology, but there's also Dale Carnegie's sort of these kind of correspondence courses about how to succeed at business and at life. And of course, you mentioned March 1967, he gets deposited in California just on the eve of the Summer of Love, someone who has kind of missed the 1960s up until this point and then is deposited in a place where the 60s are about to explode.
One of the songs Manson wrote while he was in prison was Home is Where You're Happy. And you write, quote, attempt a literal reading and sometimes you can quickly get into trouble. I will ask you the question, though, and you asked this in the book. Should we even try to take his lyrics literally?
Yeah. And I mean, one of the goals with this book is to kind of problematize, to kind of point out this practice of reading lyrics that emerged in the 1960s and say, okay, from the 1960s onward, all of a sudden we have rock critics, we have magazines like Rolling Stone or Crawdaddy, where journalists are taking rock lyrics, they're parsing them, they're trying to interpret them and dig underneath the surface to understand what they really mean, what they really tell us about the artist and about social reality. And so when I'm saying, you start to get in trouble, what I'm trying to do for the reader is to signal, okay, let's pause for a second. We all, in the year 2025, have had a half century or more of thinking about rock lyrics in this way as things to be parsed and to be interpreted, and to say, how did this come about? Why did rock lyrics become so significant or so important? Now, a lot of the narrations and stories about the Manson family really depend on us reading and interpreting the lyrics in a particular way and thinking about them as evidence for who he is, who his group is, what their motivations are. And my point there in that section is to say, let's pause for a second and think about this not as a historical fact, but as an actual historical event where rock lyrics become something that we are obligated to understand when we think about the music of Bob Dylan, when we think about the music of the Beatles, Donovan, other artists. All of a sudden, we're being asked in the late 60s to really take it seriously.
Hindsight is 2020, then people start thinking that maybe there was something in those lyrics. But then I think maybe we're giving him way too much credit. He wasn't that smart of a guy. It was just, these were just songs that he wrote. However, you do quote Phil Kaufman in the book. Phil Kaufman's been in a lot of documentaries. I've seen him often. And he was with Charlie while in prison. He put Charlie in touch with Gary Stromberg at Universal. He said that Charlie's lyrics intended to lure in the girls. And here's a quote that's from the book. Quote, when I first met him, when I got out, that wasn't the guy I knew in the prison yard singing The Shadow of Your Smile. Charlie went from Frankie Lane to kind of an acid music. He was using it. The music was a tool. These girls were lost. These children were lost. And peace and love, that was his bait. So Phil Kaufman knew him better than he knew him personally, so much better than we did. So he's saying that there was something in those lyrics, in the songs that he was writing, that was part of the combination of things. Acid was another thing. Religion, all those things seem to come together. But again, the question is, was he a mastermind planning all this while in prison, or did it just all kind of happen? He steps off that bus in San Francisco and realizes this is a whole new world and there's something I can do here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, he steps off that bus and grows a beard, grows his hair out, plays a bit of guitar, and he slips into a role that is available to him. It wouldn't have been available a couple of years ago. Like it wouldn't have been available in 64, 65, 66. It only becomes available in 67. And that's this role of guru, this role of kind of Pied Piper, singer, songwriter. I call him at one point a singing hippie mystic who can sort of pull together this patter, mix it with this emerging drug culture, which also draws on all sorts of for example, examples of high weirdness, things related to, not only folk music, but sort of science fiction and all of these emerging spiritualist religions, Scientology, the Process Church, which is a Scientology splinter group, can sort of meld all of this together. And of course, rock lyrics do provide a really fascinating vehicle for packaging all of this. And as you mentioned, in a way that is incredibly meaningful to young people. And of course, young people made up the members of the commune that he came to lead.
To that point, he could see the influence Beatles had over teens. So how much of that ran through his mind? I mean, the power of somebody like John Lennon and Paul McCartney had, what you could do with that power.
And I mean, this question of intentionality, whether or not someone like Manson would have been actively thinking about that, I'm not sure he would have. But I think it is significant. And one of the things I try to get at in the book was that other thinkers, people on the more conservative side of the spectrum, were beginning to think about the Beatles and other popular music artists as possibly hypnotizing or brainwashing young listeners. This was a critique that came from, for example, the evangelical preacher David Nobel, who I write about quite a bit. It's kind of a rehashed right-wing Cold War version of this Adorno kind of idea that mass culture brainwashes the masses. But on the other hand, on the progressive and activist and countercultural side of things, increasingly people who were writing in Rolling Stone and other countercultural newspapers were suggesting that rock and roll might also be a revolutionary force. So all of these ideas are in the air, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on.
Hey guys, we'll get back to the show, but first I want to tell you about an exclusive deal for Booked on Rock listeners. Get 15% off any purchase at oldglory.com. Over 300,000 officially licensed items covering music, sports, entertainment, and pop culture. Merchandise featuring legendary music artists like Bob Marley, The Beatles, Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and many, many more. Go to oldglory.com. Make sure to use the promo code BookedOnRock. Also find a link in this episode's show notes, or just go to bookedonrock.com and click on My Deals. He gets to LA. Chapter 2, you cover this period when he arrives in LA. He records some of his music, and this chapter covers the period from November of 67 to March of 68. Now, I've heard these tapes, and it's fascinating. They're on YouTube. What is amazing to hear is somebody who is seen as a monster manipulator, talking like a scared little boy in these tapes. I mean, Gary Stromberg was a producer, and he's trying to get Manson to calm down. He's like, it's all good, man. Chill out. It's going to be all, just relax and have fun. And Manson's just so nervous. And I think he says, I could make myself, what did he say? I can make myself nervous. You think I could make myself unnervous? And he had that real creepy laugh. And his songs, he records them. Ultimately, they don't lead to him getting signed. I feel like a few of them, there's something there, and others have said it. There is something there. I mean, he needed more polish. Maybe if he had a better attitude about things, maybe if he followed directions and wasn't, completely insane, he probably could have had a possible career. But this has come to represent the start of his motives for the Manson family murders. How much truth is there to this, do you think?
One of the stories about why the murders occurred in August 1969 is that it's at this moment, this quote unquote failed audition with Gary Stromberg at Universal in Los Angeles, probably in November 1967, that begins what I call the frustrated artist hypothesis, that this rejection by society, this initial rejection leads to further rejections. I think probably in terms of documentary evidence, the book sort of plays with different narratives and is coy about what's true and what's not true, but this probably isn't true. It actually seems like the failed audition wasn't that big a setback, this failed audition at Universal. Seems like Manson got advice from Stromberg to put together a band, to work on his music, and that's what he does. He puts together a group in late 1967 called Milky Way. This is kind of a scratch band, includes Bobby Beausoleil, a protege of Kenneth Anger, the director Kenneth Anger, who also later is still in prison for killings associated with the Manson commune. Also includes a number of different college students. They did a gig, band kind of fell apart, and it seems as if over the next year or so, music increasingly becomes central to the commune, and the commune begins these group compositions that kind of culminate by the end of 1968 in a pretty significant body of work. I'm sure we'll get to this, but your question about whether or not this, in retrospect, we can say maybe this, if we follow that narrative thread, is the beginning of this rejection, but it actually seems to have kind of jump-started this putting together a band and starting to think seriously about writing these songs.
I think you're right, though. I think it did actually inspire him to, at least it gave him something of a hope. And he thought, okay, I got something going here. I didn't get signed, but
the documentary evidence that we do have is really patchy for this period. A lot of it comes from memoirs that were written retrospectively by members of the commune that were in jail. A lot of these are self-serving memoirs, so published in the late 70s, 80s, after Vincent Bugliosi's Helter Skelter, that reproduce the narrative of Helter Skelter. But I do think that what we can see is that the group was kind of growing. People were hanging out. It was pretty loose. And so this idea of kind of some, the commune being really goal-directed toward getting a record album, probably that's not what was going on at this time.
Acid. I read people say that Charlie would give the group, the family, much more than he would take, because that allowed him to be in control. And they were also more susceptible now to mind control, to the things that he would say. It kept him enough at control while he could infiltrate the minds of the group. What role did LSD play in Charlie's control over the family?
It certainly played a role. This is one story that gets repeated quite a bit. It's found in Paul Watkins' memoir, which came out in 1980, probably most prominently. It also figures in Vincent Bugliosi's true crime book. The idea that Manson would kind of ply members of the commune with acid, and he himself would take a little bit less. Whether or not that's true or not, to me, the really interesting thing is how this particular context of sort of creating these secular rituals using acid, using music within the commune, and of course within other communes and social groups during this period, how it becomes so widespread. You mentioned earlier that a lot of the members of the commune were younger, which they were, and a lot of them were lost. And I think that's true. A lot of the people who gravitated toward this group were seekers and were looking for something. One of the ways that you can look for something is through music. One of the ways you can look is through religion, including these alternative forms of religion that are emerging. And of course, another way that you can look for things and look inside yourself, as it were, is through drugs, through hallucinogens. And by mixing all of those together into these kinds of happenings, or these semi-ritualized, secularized rituals. This isn't just going on within the commune. Of course, we see it in places like the Haight-Ashbury. We see it at electric light shows with the Grateful Dead and other kinds of groups, the electric Kool-Aid tests. I think that, sure, acid definitely played a role and is part of just the common sense moment where, okay, we can open up our minds, we can explore through music, sounds, drugs, sex, dancing, who we are and what the world is. We can sort of pierce beneath the veil of what reality looks like to dig down and figure out what is really going on.
There's no evidence of family faith, church life, or religious community that shaped Manson in any healthy or sustained way. Where did this idea of enforcing authority through religion come from? He spent half of his life in prison by that point.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, these sort of rituals, as I just mentioned, I think in part emerged because they were part of commune life in general, this sort of looking for the ritualization of everyday life through these special kinds of events. But the kind of more formal aspects of the kind of authoritarian aspects of using religion or using religious patter to, for example, control people. I mean, I think there were a lot of different models. The guru and the figure of the guru became incredibly significant during this period. Members of the Beach Boys, as well as the Beatles, of course, had their guru, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. This was something that was in the news. There were a number of other people who were gurus or guru-like figures in and within and around the counterculture. In addition to that, most directly, the commune, by the time they settled at Spahn Ranch, just outside Los Angeles, they also became involved with another cult that was just a few miles away, with a couple of the members of the commune even participating with this cult. Ed Sanders, the poet, the journalist, the founding member of the New York folk rock band The Fugs, wrote a really fascinating book that I draw on and talk about a lot in my work. And his thesis is that the commune got a lot of ideas from this other cult that was nearby. He also put forward the idea that the cult borrowed a lot of, that Manson's commune borrowed a lot of ideas from the Process Church, a Scientology splinter group. Of course, his first publisher had to pulp the first run of his book because he went a little bit too far with that theory and got sued by the Process Church, which was a very prominent group during this period in the late 60s into the early 70s.
Nicholas Tochka is the author of The Musical Lives of Charles Manson, The Beatles, The Beach Boys, and the Invention of the 60s, or No Sense Makes Sense. Accounts vary as to how Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys enters Charlie's world. You write about what the bare facts are and whether or not we can define a larger story behind those facts, or what's the most known version of what happened?
So the story that gets repeated in Bugliosi's Helter Skelter and forms the basis of most subsequent accounts is that Dennis was driving along the highway. He stopped to pick up a couple of young women who were hitchhiking. They were members of the commune. He took them back to his estate on Sunset Boulevard. They hung out, they chatted. He went to a recording studio. And then when he returned later that night, Charlie was there in the driveway to greet him. And this initiated a 3 to 5 month association where, within certain accounts, Wilson was hoodwinked. He was taken for a ride. The group stole a bunch of equipment from him. They ran up huge doctor's bills. Ed Sanders mentions the figure of $100,000, which gets bandied about. Or Wilson became a de facto member of the commune. Him and a couple of his associates, as well as the producer Terry Melcher, begin a years-long association that only ends sometime around the killings in August 1969.
Milk and cookies, right? That's the story. Dennis said, come by my place for some milk and cookies.
That's right.
Yeah. Dennis told Vincent Bugliosi, the LA deputy district attorney who prosecuted Charlie and later wrote the book Helter Skelter, as you mentioned, that, quote, Charlie never had a musical bone in his body, but there was a song that Charlie wrote, which Dennis later turned into a Beach Boys song. That was a song initially called Cease to Exist, turned into Never Learn Not to Love by the Beach Boys. Charlie was angered at not getting credit. So was Charlie a good musician?
Yeah. And this quote that Charlie never had a musical bone in his body is another one that gets bandied about a lot. It supports this thesis or this story that he, as a frustrated musician, as someone who had these kind of delusions of being someone on the level of the Beatles. He never really should have had these, that this is sort of symptomatic of some kind of mental illness or some sort of narcissism. We do know from, for example, memoir by Neil Young, who also thought about introducing Manson to producer at Warner Records. I mean, we do know that there was a lengthy musical association. A lot of the memoirs by members of the commune suggest that Charlie was playing guitar with Dennis Wilson, maybe even teaching him a few licks. There are rumors that the Beach Boys may have bought 2 songs, although the second song, whichever one that is, has never really come to light. There's a story that Manson got paid $50 for Cease to Exist, and then became so angry when they changed his lyrics that he decided to, that this sort of sped up or initiated this murderous feeling. There's another story that maybe a motorcycle had been traded for the song. And so this is kind of a moment and sort of a point that really is, I think, a little bit up for debate in the literature. But when you start to look at the actual sort of claims that people have made, and when you start to listen to the recordings, I mean, for sure, the kind of music that the commune was making was not that far off from what you would have been hearing on the radio by a number of different artists at this time.
Wasn't Stephen Stills a fan too?
Well, all of these guys who were sort of people sort of associated with this counterculture, this is where a lot of the rumors come in as to whether or not how much contact there was between this sort of celebrity culture and the Manson commune. Members of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, members of the Mamas and the Papas, even a couple of sort of new Hollywood actors. Whether and how much interaction these groups had. I will say the one person who is sort of most prominently on the record, as I mentioned, is Neil Young, saying that, he was a good musician. We like these kind of weird improvisatory sing-song things he did.
You write, quote, with so many events piling up between April and June of 1968, our narrative thread has begun fraying. What we know is that the Manson family is now living at Spahn Ranch, and the Beatles start working on what allegedly became Charlie's Bible, the White Album. Were the sessions at Spahn Ranch more extreme than elsewhere? What was he doing at that time? Because I've heard was the story that he would have the girls, eventually when the White Album comes out, have them listen to it over and over again. And then one of the girls wanted to get up and use the bathroom, but he's like, no, not until the album's complete.
Yeah. So we have this period at Spahn Ranch, which happens across 1968. Beatles' White Album, by the way, comes out in November 1968. At the end of this period, around October, maybe early November 1968, the group moves from Spahn Ranch to the desert. While they're at Spahn Ranch during this initial period, it does seem like communal music making is taking on a much larger role within the group. It also seems as if the group has kind of cohered into something that began to be called or conceived of as a family. But music making at this point isn't necessarily the primary focal point. When they move to the desert at the end of this period, that's where music becomes the real sort of focal point for the group, among a couple of other things. They create in the desert what they call the desert songs. They rehearse them. There's a recording of these desert songs that's been released only in the late 1980s that was recorded after Manson was in prison with a member of the commune named Clem, or Steve Grogan, playing guitar and singing lead vocals. The arrangements on these sound like late 1960s fare. The whole group sings. The young women in the commune sing backing vocals in multiple parts. There are, it seems, more sort of complex arrangements. And there's also this growing mythos that you can discern in the lyrics, where the lyrics themselves talk about the group and its goings on. It's sort of internal mythology that's beginning to emerge. So as to your question about whether or not it's more extreme, they do become a kind of singing family. And it seems as if during this initial period in Los Angeles in the summer of 1968, they're largely seen as a novelty act by Hollywood celebrities. But they at least by the end of 1968 into early 1969, certainly begin to take their own music making more seriously. And then, of course, get into listening to the White Album.
Hey guys, thanks so much for checking out the Booked on Rock podcast. If you've just found the podcast, welcome. If you've been listening, thank you so much for your support. And make sure you tell a friend, a family member, share on social media, and let people know about Booked on Rock. And if you do like the podcast, make sure you subscribe, give a 5-star review wherever you listen to the Booked on Rock podcast. We're on Amazon, Apple, iHeart, Spotify, Spreaker, TuneIn, and on YouTube Music. You can check out the full episodes on video, along with video highlights from episodes on the Booked on Rock YouTube channel. Find it at Booked on Rock. Thanks again for listening. Now back to the show. Now, this is the part I think that's most interesting for me. It's the most thought-provoking and makes me wonder. And it was Bugliosi who finalized that helter-skelter theory. Charlie used the term a lot. He seemed to be obsessed with it. He tied it to Beatles lyrics, revelation, and an apocalyptic race war that he believed was imminent. He wrote in the book, quote, "Over the past 3 decades, a group of revisionists has demanded we reject the so-called helter-skelter story." Was this a case of Bugliosi using that theory to prove his case? I work in the law field, and I think about this now more than ever before, maybe simplifying things. Oddly enough, I work for jury administration, okay? So I'm dealing with jurors in the state of Connecticut, right? So is he simplifying things for a jury to better grasp what he's trying to get across to win the case and put away Charles Manson? Does that make sense? I mean, is there anything to that, you think?
I think we can approach that question in a couple of ways. So one way is to think about, well, what actual evidence do we have? What is the evidence, and where does it come from for the fact that the White Album was a kind of Bible? You mentioned in your previous question that at some point during this time, Charlie began these almost sermons, what he called talk-tos, where he would sit members of the group down. They would listen to the White Album. He would interpret it. He, by all accounts, had a memory where he could recite long passages of the Bible. He could, like many music fans then and now, recite long passages of lyrics. And it does seem as if these discussions were more and more significant. Now, a couple of different memoirs have framed these talk-tos or sermons differently. Some of them frame them as a kind of play, as something that the group was doing that was intended to be play acting, a sort of pretending that the group had been doing for a number of months at this point. A couple of accounts, especially Diane Lake, her very recent memoir, paints it as much more serious, as apocalyptic. So the evidence here is contrasting as to how seriously different people took it. I tend to fall on the side of Squeaky Fromme, or Lynette Fromme. I tend to find her account most compelling, that she suggests that by early 1969, the group was beginning to get larger. It was beginning to diversify. There were some young men who were into hanging out, riding motorcycles, maybe dealing drugs. There were a lot of young women who were ecologically conscious and radicalized, who were into a kind of revolutionary environmental movement, a real anti-mainstream countercultural moment. And then there was a smaller group of people who were kind of young hippies, who were really turned on by the idea about rock music being so important, and that Charlie tailored his message to these different groups in different ways. And as to your question about, as a prosecutor, Bugliosi is looking to create a narrative that makes sense, that's legible to the jurors that he's going to be working with. And I think that it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg question here as to whether or not he finds in this rock narrative something that is going to resonate with jurors, kind of a ready-made package that will feed into ideas they already have about the counterculture and how wild and how anti-establishment it is, and also how kind of silly it is in a way, or whether or not this ultimately, this glomming onto this particular narrative actually further generates an idea of the counterculture as being irrational. But for sure, it makes sense as a package for jurors.
So Charlie still had hopes of a career in music at this point. Now, you mentioned Terry Melcher. So let's talk about Terry Melcher now. Doris Day's son, music producer, connected with the Byrds, really well known at the time. He meets him through Dennis Wilson, right?
That's right. So this is another kind of point within the story where, again, narratives are really, they conflict with each other. Terry Melcher was the tenant at the Cielo Drive house where the Tate killings happened, where Sharon Tate, wife of Roman Polanski, an actress, was living for the first night of the murders. There's some evidence, and here we haven't yet mentioned his name, but I should bring up probably the most recent big book about the Manson killings is by Tom O'Neill, and it's titled Chaos. And it really delves into all of the conspiracy theories that were swirling around then up until now. It's based on a lot of reporting and interviews that he did, that this is where these ideas of Terry Melcher being much more involved in a more long-standing way with the commune most recently have come from. So the idea that Manson and the group had maybe even been to Cielo Drive, had been somehow associated with Melcher and others prior to the killings. A lot of this evidence comes from his book, which kind of paints this really sort of conspiratorial image of possible government involvement, of possible conspiracy theories behind the scenes, which
CIA mind control.
Exactly, that this is his thesis is that there was this, there was a project MK Ultra that was a CIA funded mind control program that, according to O'Neill, had offshoots in California that brought Manson and the commune possibly directly into, he suggests that at times maybe the Manson family was itself a government experiment gone wrong, that Charles Manson's parole officer was someone who was heading a kind of a government trial to see how speed could influence and even foment violence within the counterculture. I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but that's because, you know, the story about Melcher is really, really complicated. And within sort of my book, one of the things I try to do is to historicize this conspiracy theorizing, because O'Neill wasn't the first one to be suggesting this. In fact, countercultural newspapers at the time were beginning to suggest that maybe the government had put the Manson family up to this to discredit the counterculture.
As far back as the late 60s, early 70s, huh?
As early as late 1969, countercultural newspapers were mentioning this. As early as 1970, 1971, Mae Brussels, the sort of conspiracy theorist par excellence, was positing that the Manson commune was somehow related to government programs. For
And
sure.
the idea that it went too far. And after what happens with the murders, that now they want to suppress, they don't want anybody to know about it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It went too far. Experimentation that went drastically too far.
Either the commune were sort of unknowing dupes who were being drugged or fed drugs, or sort of put into this sort of pressure cooker situation to see what would happen, or that Manson himself was somehow directly connected to government agents. I mean, these are the conspiracy theories.
Yeah, you write, quote, "The passage of time inevitably smooths the rough and ragged edges of a phenomena in the round, leaving only two dimensional representations. With regards to the Tate LaBianca killings, 3 primary narratives and many more variants remain. Now, the most common story I've heard is that although Melcher found some of Charlie's songs interesting, pretty good, but ultimately not enough to really move forward with, doesn't sign Manson, contact fades, that rejection becomes hugely significant in Manson's mind, even though Melcher had already moved out of Cielo Drive by 1969. Manson remained fixated on that address, leading to the murders that later occurred there. That's one of the 3 primary narratives?
Yeah, so I'd say that's the frustrated artist, we've been rejected by society and we're going to scare them, we're going to commit violence. Yeah.
The other 2, one of them is drug related, right? Lots of Papa, this guy.
That's right. So one of them is this larger sort of set of theories about crime, that maybe the group was involved in drug trafficking, that they had connections to this African-American man named Bernard Crow, also known as Lots of Papa, who was dealing drugs, that maybe people who were at the Tate house also had links to drugs. Even the LaBianca family, a lot of this is extremely distasteful because we have to remember, of course, that we're talking about real people who really lost their lives. The conspiracy theorizing comes in where there are these dot points that are pulled together by authors to suggest that there is some sort of larger cover-up related to drugs in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, drawing in, for example, and some of them are more fanciful, like there are these theories about Mama Cass of the Papas and the Mamas and the Papas having CIA connections and drug running connections. Some of them are just a little bit more tawdry, that the Manson commune and especially a couple of the men involved with them were just basically drug dealers by this point. Yep. So that's the second sort of cluster of theories.
He's the only person to serve a life in prison for murder without actually physically committing the crime.
Well, yeah, and you asked the question earlier about Bugliosi and why the helter-skelter thesis. I mean, this is another potential way we can think about why Bugliosi would have pushed forward the helter-skelter thesis. Because Manson wasn't actually actively involved in the killings on either of those 2 nights, the actual trials hinged in part on whether or not he had criminal culpability in having brainwashed or somehow forced the members of the commune to do these killings.
Was Manson really all that? Was he just made out to be that way? The media really portrayed him that way, and he loved it, and he played on that. And meanwhile, he was just, because he was a petty criminal before all of this. And they said a really bad criminal. I mean, he would steal cars and
stupid stuff,
and he would get caught all the time.
Yeah, cashing, stealing checks, stuff like that. I mean, all the accounts that we do have from that period of people who were somehow connected with the commune throughout 1967, they do see a kind of increased paranoia, increased violence, increased connections to local biker gangs that begin to occur. As the sort of high point of music making within the commune, which was early 1969, late 1968, that begins to give way to much more kind of base, tawdry criminal activity for sure.
Find the Booked on Rock website at bookedonrock.com. There you can find all the back episodes of the show, the latest episode in video and audio, links to all of the platforms where you can listen to the podcast, plus all the social media platforms. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and X. Also, check out the Booked on Rock blog, find your local independent bookstore, find out all the latest hot rock book releases, and before you go, check out the Booked on Rock online store. Pick up some Booked on Rock merch. It's all at bookedonrock.com. While Helter Skelter suggests that Manson had little contact with Wilson and Melcher from this point, more recent research has revealed that investigators turned up evidence to the contrary. Melcher was seen tripping out on his knees, begging Manson to forgive him. Is that true? And is there some kind of cover-up too? That's the other thing.
Yeah, and so this is the claim that comes from Tom O'Neill's Chaos that we were just talking about a minute ago. And I guess for the purposes of what I was trying to do in my book, one of the things I was trying to demonstrate and to comment on was not whether or not there was a cover-up or whether or not there was a conspiracy, but rather how the actual kind of genre of the conspiracy theory became so significant to narrations of this case in particular, but also how we conceptualize and think about American history more broadly. I mean, some people have suggested that we're kind of living through a new period of conspiracy theorizing, which we probably are with QAnon and the Epstein files and all of these kind of contemporary sort of claims about sort of the deep state and so on. I think one thing that I was trying to demonstrate in the book is that there's kind of a line connecting this moment back to conspiracy theorizing in the 60s, where everything looked like a cover-up, from JFK's assassination to much more fanciful kinds of conspiracies that we've kind of forgotten about today. Like, for example, the countercultural conspiracy that the government might put hippies in concentration camps. This was something that was widely commented on and discussed in the late 60s, early 70s. The conspiracy that either the US government or hippies or some other unknown entity might put LSD into a water supply and dose an entire town. There were pulp fiction written about this. There was a film made about this, but there were also news stories suggesting that this might really happen and suggesting how it could happen.
Last question I have for you, Nicholas, is rock music an easy scapegoat? Because it's forever intertwined with these murders. Manson's music with the Beatles, with Dennis Wilson, Terry Melcher, has it been fairly or unfairly characterized in terms of it being a motivation for what Manson and its followers did?
Within this helter-skelter narrative, rock music is just incredibly powerful. So I guess what I would say is that, yeah, maybe it's a scapegoat, but really what these stories communicate to us is that rock music is incredibly powerful. It's a tool that can brainwash people. It's something that can even be contributed to getting relatively normal people to be turned into monsters, to murder. I don't necessarily think that that's true, but what I do think is that it tells us something about this moment in the late 1960s. It tells us something about how people thought about personhood, about human minds, about the sort of integrity of the personality, all of these Cold War categories. It also tells us something about the significance of popular culture within the American imagination, about the power of rock music, rock musicians, and the power of artists like the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and others.
This book, really, you read the book and you leave it for the reader to really decide what they think. You know, I look back after reading this book and I wonder now how much of this was really planned by Charles Manson and how much of it he just went with it and things just kind of snowballed, and then he just reveled in the attention that he got from it, and did right up until the end. The theory of the CIA, the mind control, that's a hard one for people to wrap their head around. However, there's evidence there to suggest that it is certainly possible. So people need to read the book, The Musical Lives of Charles Manson, to decide for themselves. And it's out now. You can find it wherever books are sold. It's available online at your nearest bookstore. If you have an independent bookstore nearby, look for it there. You can go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. And Nicholas, where can people find you online?
You can Google my name, find my website, find me on Blue Sky, and yeah, send me a note. Always happy to hear from readers, people who are interested in my work.
Nicholas Tochka, thank you so much. This was so great.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate it.
That's it. It's in the books.